There are those who would like you to believe that the Zapruder film, shown here in an enhanced version prepared by John P. Costella, Ph.D., which removes aspect ratio and pincushion distortion, sequences the frames in the proper order, restores lost or missing frames, is the nearest thing to absolute truth that we have about the assassination of JFK. Unfortunately, however, like so much else of the evidence in this case, it has been subjected to massive editing and alteration, just as has so much else as what I am about to present is going to explain. Lyndon Johnson forced himself on the ticket in Los Angeles in 1960, threatening to reveal that JFK had had an amorous relationship with a beautiful woman who turned out to be an East German spy, that he suffered from Addison's disease and was not expected to live a long, healthy life, and that, were he not on the ticket, any legislative proposals sent down by the White House would be dead on arrival. He later told reporters that he had studied American history and found that 1 in 4 presidents had not survived their terms, and that he was a gambling man. But Lyndon only bet on sure things. Shots appear to have been fired from all of these locations: the County Records Building, the Dal-Tex, the Book Depository, but not from the alleged assassin's lair, the Grassy Knoll, number 3, above-ground sewer openings on the north and south ends of the Triple Underpass, number 4 and number 5. Zapruder was supposed to have been filming from number 2, and a bystander was injured by a shot that missed at number 6. Officially, JFK was killed by a shot that hit him at number 1. Lee Oswald was wearing a distinctive shirt when he was arrested. Notice its texture, its long sleeves, and its tattered condition at the bottom. He had a t-shirt on beneath it, which he tended to tug at the neck and thereby stretched out. There are more than 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting JFK up for the hit. 2 agents were left behind at Love Field by the agent in charge of the protection detail, Emory Roberts. They were surprised. Most tellingly, the vehicles were in an improper sequence. The presidential limousine was placed first. Lower-ranking dignitaries, such as the mayor and the vice president, should have preceded him. Reporters were moved to the rear and the president's personal physician to the last car. The manhole covers were not welded, open windows were not covered, and the crowd was allowed to spill into the street. The motorcycle escort was cut down to 4 and instructed not to ride forward of the rear wheels. One of the officers said it was the damnedest formation he had ever seen. Does anyone in their right mind believe that this would be appropriate security for the President of the United States? Governor Connolly was instrumental in making a change to the motorcade route on 18 November 1963, 4 days before the event. Normally, a motorcade route, once fixed, is never changed. It brought the president past the Texas School Book Depository. After the assassination, no measures were taken to secure the area in which the shooting had taken place. Traffic was allowed to pass freely through the plaza. At Parkland Hospital, where the moribund president was taken, a Secret Service agent took a bucket and sponge and began cleaning up the blood and brains from the limousine. When onlookers noticed a through-and-through hole in the windshield, the vehicle was moved. By Monday, 25 November 1963, the day of the formal state funeral, the vehicle had been sent back to Ford Motor Company to be completely rebuilt, including replacing the windshield, which had a through-and-through bullet hole to the right and center facing the vehicle. According to the Warren Report, 1964, a lone gunman fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, scoring 2 hits and 1 miss, which injured the distant bystander James Tague, who was observing from location 6. It was the injury to Tague that forced the commission to abandon the original 3-shot, 3-hit scenario. Another hit near a manhole cover on the grass opposite the grassy knoll. There appears to have been 8, 9, or 10 shots altogether. As Kenny O'Donnell later remarked to Tip O'Neill, bullets were whizzing all over the place. One hit the chrome strip over the limousine windshield. The miss meant that it was necessary to account for all the wounds on the basis of only 2 shots. That led to the imaginative concoction of the magic bullet, which was portrayed by Gerald Posner, as shown here. The jacket JFK was wearing shows a hole about 5.5 inches below the collar, which contradicts the official location of the wound. If the bullet entered here, especially at a downward angle, then it is difficult to imagine how it could have passed through his neck. Officially, 1 shot hit the president in the back of his neck, passed through his neck without hitting any bony structures, and entered the back of Governor John Connally, inflicting multiple wounds. It shattered a rib, damaged his right wrist, and entered his left thigh. A bullet hole in the shirt also turns out to be about 5.5 inches below the collar, too low to correspond to the official location at the base of the back of the neck. Neither the shirt nor the jacket were sent forward to Bethesda for the autopsy, a violation of autopsy protocol. Humes was assisted by J. Thornton Boswell, U.S. Navy Medical Corps, who, like Humes, had never performed an autopsy on a gunshot victim before. His diagram of the wounds shows a wound to the back about 5.5 inches below the collar. It was even verified by Admiral George Berkeley, the president's personal physician. One of 2 FBI agents who witnessed the autopsy, James Siebert, drew a diagram showing the relative location of the wounds, where the back wound is lower than the throat wound, making it most unlikely they were connected by a shot from above and behind. Admiral Berkeley composed a death certificate on JFK, which said he had been struck in the head and that a second wound occurred at the posterior back at about the level of the 3rd thoracic vertebrae. The head wound involved evisceration of the right hemisphere of the brain. Even the Warren Commission staff concluded that the back shot had been at that location, as this reenactment photograph displays. The larger circular patch on the back of the stand-in's jacket represents the back wound, the smaller above it the official entry wound to the head. Arlen Specter, then a junior counsel to the Warren Commission, uses a pointer here to exhibit the path the magic bullet would have had to have taken. The larger patch is visible below his left hand, which means that a photo intended to illustrate the theory actually refutes it. You would have thought the Warren Commission's staff were the only persons in America who did not know that JFK was riding in a Lincoln limousine at the time. The reconstruction was done using the Secret Service Cadillac, which meant that studies based upon it had no forensic significance. An early document released by the Assassination Records Review Board, the ARRB, showed that Gerald Ford, a Republican from Michigan, then a commission member, had had the back wound re-described from his uppermost back, which was already an exaggeration, to the base of the back of his neck. David W. Mantic, MD, PhD, who is board certified in radiation oncology, which is the treatment of cancer using X-ray therapy, took a CAT scan of a patient with chest and neck dimensions similar to those of JFK. When he plotted the official trajectory, it turned out to be anatomically impossible. Cervical vertebrae intervene. When the actual entry location is combined with the rest of the magic trajectory, the theory lends itself to ridicule, as in Oliver Stone's JFK. The bullet alleged to have performed these feats was nevertheless virtually pristine, with only slight longitudinal distortion. At 1 p.m., 22 November 1963, Malcolm Kilduff, acting press secretary, announced that the president was dead, explaining it was a simple matter of a bullet through the head while pointing to his right temple, and attributing that finding to JFK's personal physician, Admiral George Berkeley. During a press conference at 3:15 p.m., Malcolm Perry, MD, who had performed a tracheostomy through a small wound in the president's throat, explained 3 times that the wound was a wound of entry. The transcript, however, would not be provided to the Warren Commission. Charles Crenshaw, MD, who was present during the efforts to revive JFK at Parkland, drew these diagrams of the appearance of the throat wound before and after the tracheotomy incision, which are consistent with Dr. Perry's description of it as a wound of entry. Suspicions that the body was altered between Parkland and Bethesda are supported by changes in the appearance of the throat wound in photographs, allegedly from the autopsy. Dr. Crenshaw had closed JFK's eyes at Parkland. Notice, too, the absence of the massive defect in the photo on the right from the House Select Committee on Assassinations reinvestigation, to which I shall return. Dr. Crenshaw also drew the massive blowout to the back of his head, which he described as the size of a baseball or of your fist when you double it up. During an interview broadcast on television, he also described an entry wound at the right temple, consistent with the mortician's description. Physician after physician at Parkland described cerebellar as well as cerebral tissue extruding from the massive defect at the back of his head. The cerebellum is situated at the base of the skull. The cerebrum is a larger mass that comprises the upper portions of the brain. Blown out tissue of these kinds will look very different in their appearance. Even first-year medical students would not confuse them. Robert B. Livingston, MD, a world authority on the human brain and an expert on wound ballistics, studied reports of cerebral and cerebellar damage from Parkland. He concluded that the brain, shown in diagrams and photographs at the National Archives, which is virtually completely intact and has an undamaged cerebellum, cannot be that of JFK. The other shot entered the back of his head and exited at the top, killing him according to the official account. Navy artist H.A. Rydberg was instructed what to draw by Commander James Humes, U.S. Navy Medical Corps, who conducted the autopsy. He was not given access to the body or even to photographs. Other autopsy photographs show massive debris entangled in long hair, leading the ARRB to ask Dr. Humes if the subject had been given a shampoo and a haircut during the autopsy, since these photographs are so blatantly inconsistent. Humes replied, "No, no, no, no." When the House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, reinvestigated the case in 1977-78, its medical panel concluded that the entry wound was actually 4 inches above the entry location previously specified. It was depicted in diagrams right, but not visible in photographs left. The piece of bone extending to the right above the ear is the skull flap that allegedly was blown open when JFK was hit by a frangible or exploding bullet. A substantial chunk of bone from the right rear of the head was found Saturday after the assassination by a medical student named Billy Harper. It was in the grass to the left of the limousine's location at the time of the shooting. How could this piece of skull be reconciled with the HSCA reconstruction? This is not the only deception perpetrated by the HSCA. Another diagram of the head wound by Robert McClellan, MD, who was also present at Parkland, depicts a massive blowout that fits Dr. Crenshaw's description. It was a terrible wound. Some 40 witnesses from Dealey Plaza, from Parkland, and from Bethesda, including bystanders, physicians, medical technicians, and an agent of the FBI, reported that JFK had a massive blowout to the back of the head, the location of which they demonstrated with their hands. David Mantic, MD, PhD, has undertaken extensive and meticulous studies of the official JFK autopsy x-rays. Here is a pre-mortem, before-death x-ray to show how it aligns with the cranium of JFK. Those eyewitness reports were discounted on the grounds that the autopsy x-rays don't show it. Mantic, a PhD in physics, used a simple technique of optical densitometry to prove that an area, identified here as area P, had been patched using material far too dense to be human bone, or else by using a mask to protect the surrounding area while blasting area P with light. James H. Fetzer suspected that those who were involved in reconstructing home movies of the assassination, including the Zapruder, might have overlooked frames past 313 to 316 that display the wound to the back of the head. He found an image of the blowout in frame 374. That pink part, notice, by the way, is the skull flap seen in the HSCA diagrams and photographs, where the blowout is the grayish area to its left and behind. Mantic also discovered that a 6.5 millimeter metallic slice had been added to other cranial x-rays in an evident attempt to implicate the obscure Mannlicher Carcano carbine Oswald is alleged to have used. But the weapon is not high velocity and cannot have fired the bullets that killed JFK if he was killed by high velocity bullets, as the Warren Commission report maintains. Mantic also detected small pieces of lead in the X-ray left, a pattern expected from a frangible or exploding bullet that entered his right temple. It may also have been a mercury-loaded bullet. The heavier pieces traveled further and were distributed along the axis shown on the right. The mortician who prepared the body for burial, who spent more time with the body than anyone else, told an investigator that in addition to the large gaping hole in the back of the head, there was a small wound in the right temple and a wound on the back, 5 to 6 inches below the shoulder to the right of the spinal column. There was no discoloration of the face, which means that he died instantly. When you compare the observations from Parkland on the left with the autopsy report from Bethesda in the center and the HSCA diagrams and photographs on the right, the absurdity of the situation becomes apparent. Here is Lieutenant Day of the Dallas Police Department removing what would be claimed to have been the assassination rifle. Notice the clip, which should not be there. When a Mannlicher Carcano is loaded, the clip falls out when the final round of a 7-round clip is chambered. No 7 rounds or even the clip were found, where this one appears to have been painted in. Lee Oswald was framed using Life magazine, whose owners had close ties to the CIA. The chin is a block chin, not Oswald's more pointed chin, and there is an insert line between the chin and the lower lip in the photograph, as seen on the left. The photograph was a fake. His fingertips were cut off. The shadows from his nose and eyebrows was inconsistent with the shadow cast by his figure. Jack White used the newspapers he was holding as an internal yardstick and discovered that either the person shown was only 5 foot 6 inches tall, too short to be Oswald, who was 5 foot 10, or the image of the newspapers had been introduced too large. There are 4 photographs with an additional missing negative where the face is exactly the same across each of their different poses taken at different times. This is not simply improbable, but optically impossible. A map that would be necessary to create them was found in the desk of a Dallas detective who said he had only created it to see if it could be done. Officially, Lee was on the 6th floor and, after killing JFK, rushed across the warehouse floor, stashed his trusty Mannlicher Carcano, and raced down 4 flights of stairs to enter the lunchroom and to have a Coke. He was confronted there within 90 seconds of the shooting by motorcycle patrolman Marion Baker, who held him in his sights until Roy Truly, Lee's supervisor, assured Baker he was an employee who belonged in the building. Both described him as acting perfectly normal, neither winded nor out of breath, but, Truly added, somewhat startled to find an officer pointing his revolver at him. Oswald was seen leaving his boarding house by his landlady at 1:30. He appears to have headed south on Crawford toward Jefferson and the Texas Theater. The Warren Commission concluded he had turned east onto 10th Street, where he ran into a policeman. 4 rounds from an automatic were initially found at the scene, but Oswald had a revolver. It is difficult to imagine he would have shot Officer J.D. Tippett 4 times, 3 in the torso and once in the right temple, then paused to remove the incriminating cartridges from his weapon. Aquila Clemens, who saw the shooting take place, said 2 men had shot Tippett and that neither of them looked like Lee Oswald. The assassination went down at 12:30. In about an hour and 20 minutes' time, the police had apprehended Lee Oswald, who had worked in the book depository for less than 6 weeks. A former Marine, he had defected to the Soviet Union and married a Russian woman. The arrest report for Lee Oswald stated, "This man shot and killed President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippit. He also shot and wounded Governor Connally. The time was 1:40. That was very fast work, especially considering he was actually arrested 10 minutes later." A nitrate test which revealed traces on his hands, but not on his cheek, was doubly exculpating. While he might have fired a revolver, he had not fired a carbine. Washing his face would have washed his hands too. He worked in a depository with books printed in ink, which contains nitrates. Evidence photographs taken in Dallas showed only 2 spent shell casings. Number 1, a paper bag displaying no signs of having been used to carry a Mannlicher Carcano assembled or disassembled into the book depository. 7, a large metal fragment removed from Governor Connally. 3, and an unspent cartridge. Number 6, that the metal fragment 3 is too large to have come from the magic bullet provides another proof that the official account is false. Here is another official evidence photograph showing 2 spent shell casings and 1 unspent cartridge. This is the weapon that was booked by the Dallas police. This is the weapon that was booked by the FBI in Washington, D.C., when all of the evidence was transferred from Dallas to Washington. Remarkably, they are not the same. With a muzzle velocity of only 2,000 feet per second, the Mannlicher Carcano is not a high-velocity weapon, which have muzzle velocities of 2,600 feet per second and higher. If JFK had been killed by high-velocity bullets, as the Warren report maintains, then he was not killed by a Mannlicher Carcano. Taken by James Alchins, this famous photograph shows 1, the through-and-through hole in the windshield, 2, an Oswald look-alike, probably a co-worker named Billy Lovelady, according to the official account, in the doorway of the building, the open window of a closet belonging to a uranium mining company, number 3, that was a CIA asset from which 3 shots appeared to have been fired. And 4th, the Secret Service assigned to Vice President Johnson responding, even while the presidential detail seems to be unaware of what's going on. The above is a close-up of the bullet hole. Even though the limousine had been sent back to Ford Motor Company and rebuilt, including replacing the windshield, on Monday, 25 November 1963, the day of the official state funeral, the Secret Service produced yet a different windshield in its place, which showed some cracks from a fragment alleged to have come from behind, which is seen on the right. The hole is also evident in frame 225. Dr. Livingston thought that this bullet probably fragmented upon impact, part going downward into his right lung, part upward, rupturing the tough tentorium, a membrane which covers the cerebellum. If so, then Jack's death was brought about by a causal interaction between the shot to the throat and the 2 shots to his head. Here is the doorway area, which is proven to have been extensively altered. Here are the notes of Will Fritz, the homicide detective who interrogated Lee. Lee told him he had been out with Bill Shelley in front during the shooting. Close examination of the doorway area shows a man's face has been scratched off. Call him obfuscated man. The figure leaning out is missing his left shoulder. Call him doorman. And the man behind him wearing a narrow black tie, call him black tie man is both in front of him and behind him at the same time. This appears to have been a rush job, probably precipitated by Lee's telling Fritz where he was during the shooting. To appreciate the missing shoulder, each of us has a shoulder bone known as the clavicle, except that Doorman was missing his left clavicle. Meticulous studies have been done to identify those who were in this area at the time. Notice the black man's profile, which blocks the bottom of the shirt worn by Doorman, which appears to have resulted from perspective, but makes the shirt more difficult to identify. Richard Hook has conducted study after study of the similarities between the shirt that Lee was wearing when he was arrested and the shirt being worn by Doorman. They appear to be the same with regard to feature after feature. The claim was made that Doorman was a co-worker named Billy Lovelady, but Billy pointed out that he was 3 inches shorter and 15 to 20 pounds heavier than Lee. On 29 February 1964, he even went to the FBI and showed them the shirt he had been wearing that day. It was a short-sleeved, red and white, vertically striped shirt, which bears no resemblance to the shirt worn by Doorman. The FBI's own report to Director J. Edgar Hoover explains that Lovelady, quote, stated he was wearing a red and white vertically striped shirt and blue jeans, end quote, which they duly photographed and forwarded to FBI headquarters. Another figure in the area in front of the doorway has been alleged to have been Billy Lovelady, wearing a checkered shirt. But he looks nothing like Billy Lovelady and more like a gorilla. Plus, he is bulging out of his shirt and has it buttoned up to the top. He does not look like Billy or like Doorman. Features of Billy appear to have been imposed over Doorman's face to make him look more like Lovelady. Indeed, the distant FBI photo appears to have been altered to make Billy look more like Lee. The objective was to create confusion in order to leave the question in a state of uncertainty. Other moves were made to create the available version of the doorway area in the Alchin's photograph, as Richard Hook explains here. When I first learned Lee had told Fritz he was out with Bill Shelley in front, I began to study the question. I found this collage on a website of John McAdams, who is a prominent defender of the official account. Notice the obfuscated face, which I have circled in orange, and the multiple images of Gorilla Man. This is a virtually perfect example of disinformation. When I published this and explained that I believe the man whose face had been obscured had to have been Oswald, I was contacted by Ralph Sinkay, who told me that if you focus on the clothing and the body type, you can tell that Lee is there, but is actually Doorman instead. His background as a chiropractor was exactly what the case required to shatter the myth that Doorman was Lovelady. In their efforts to defeat our discovery that Oswald was Doorman, some apologists for the Warren Report have posted copies of issues of obscure newspapers dated 22 November 1963, featuring the Alchin's 6, as it is technically known, to support their claim that it could not have been altered because there wasn't enough time, as though obfuscated faces, missing shoulders, and being in front of and behind at the same time were normal. How dumb are we supposed to be? Ralph Sinkay exposed the hoax by discovering both the fabricated and the original issues of the Beacon Hills, Michigan News Palladium. This shows how far the CIA is willing to go to deceive the American people using taxpayers' funds for the promotion of false information. they had fabricated and substituted false issues of those obscure newspapers for 22 November 1963. Here is one of the last photographs of Jack and Jackie turning from Houston onto Elm just before the shooting would take place. Many of us suspect that the vans in the background were command and control locations during the assassination. John Costella, who is a PhD in physics too, this time with a specialization in electromagnetism, the properties of light and images of moving objects, has produced a new improved version of the Zapruder film and has demonstrated that, although nearly technically perfect, it includes some revealing flaws. One of the signs that the film is a fabrication is the nearly motionless line of spectators. Those who have seen another film, which appears to be the original, have reported they were waving and cheering, not as seen here. As David Healy has observed, the use of optical printing and special effects allows for the combination of any foreground with any background and allows changes to the activities of the figures portrayed. This footage appears to have been taken when the pilot car passed by, not when the presidential limousine was present. The ghost panels in the sprocket area establish visual links between the frames of the film, which had to be reshot in a film laboratory lest the fakery be immediately detected. This is why the whole film is a fabrication. It was done using authentic images, which were then subjected to alteration. This frame shows the umbrella man and the Cuban, who is shaking his fist, probably as an indication to the driver, William Greer, to bring the limo to a halt. The umbrella man, who by pumping it up and down was apparently signaling the shooters that their target was not dead and to keep on shooting, may have been Roy Hargraves and the Cuban Felipe Vidal Santiago. In an interview with Noel Twyman, Hargraves admitted he was in Dallas that day as part of a support team for the assassination, and that they were acting on orders from the CIA's JM Wave Station in Miami. The first frames from the Zapruder film to which the public had access were published in Life. Most were unremarkable, but this one, frame 313, posed special problems. The plate was broken twice to revise description 6, which appears to be unique in the history of publishing. There are many indications this and other films have been edited, including the all but motionless spectators, the driver's head turns twice as fast as humanly possible, and the blob and blood spray, which appear to have been painted in. Blood and brains across the trunk, and the drivers pulling to the left and bringing the vehicle to a halt, had to be removed because it was such an obvious indication of Secret Service complicity in setting up JFK for the hit. Here is the original sequence of frames 313 through 316 in the altered Zapruder film. When the frames were published in the 26 volumes of supporting evidence, however, they were in the wrong sequence, greatly mitigating the back and to the left motion of JFK's head in the extant film. David S. Lifton had a friend write to J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, and Hoover acknowledged they were in the wrong order. Michael Batten, head of the medical panel for the HSCA, has observed that if the magic bullet theory is false, then there had to have been at least 6 shots from 3 directions, which turns out to be correct. Even the revised film contains damning evidence. When frames 312 and 313 are compared, they show forward movement. Following frame 313, there is a powerful back and to the left movement, which was emphasized in Oliver Stone's JFK. Many students have taken this as proof that he was hit from behind and from the front, implying a conspiracy. But none of the witnesses reporting observing that back and to the left motion, that violent back and to the left motion at the time. Those who have seen the other film have reported that after being hit in the back of the head, he slumped forward. Jackie eased him back up and was looking him right in the face when he was hit in the right temple and then slumped to the left into the seat. It looks as though they created the very strong impression of forceful motion by removing too many frames and thereby accelerating the apparent motion of his head and body. Mary Moorman with her Polaroid and Jean Hill in her red coat were there on the grass opposite the knoll, which Jean named the grassy knoll. They were active, where Jean called out to JFK, "Hey, Mr. President, look over here. We want to take your picture." But in the extant film, they hardly move at all. Noel Twyman noticed that in the frame on the left, the background is blurred and the foreground is precise, while in the frame on the right, both are in focus. Roderick Ryan, who had received the Academy Award for his contributions to special effects cinematography in 2000, explained to Noel that that was because the camera was following the car in motion on the left, but that the car was stationary in the frame on the right. Jack White, a legendary student of the JFK photos and films, noticed that the Nix film, taken from the grass opposite the knoll, unlike the Zapruder film, shows Mary in the street about to take her famous photograph, which is one more indication of the faking of the Zapruder, where the Nix and other home movies were also altered to conform with it, but it was not done to perfection. Jean has been ridiculed for remarking that she had seen a fluffy little white dog between Jack and Jackie, which certainly sounds strange at first. But it turned out to be a puppet, lamb chop, which one of her young fans had given to Jackie, which means that instead of discrediting Jean's testimony, this discovery makes it all the more credible. Here is Mary's famous photograph taken a fraction of a second after JFK was hit in the right temple. A chunk of his skull and brains can be seen on his right shoulder. Jack White and Gary Mack, who is now the curator of the 6th floor museum, discovered the image of a shooter wearing a police uniform, who is referred to in the literature as Badge Man. At least a half a dozen persons have reported observing the other film, where the major points they make about it, in contrast to the available film, are: first, it begins with a turn from Houston onto Elm. Second, Greer brings the limo to an abrupt halt, jostling the passengers forward. Third, JFK is hit twice during the stop. And fourth, Greer watches JFK the whole time, only turning back and accelerating after his brains have been blown out. In addition, Officer James Cheney on the right side rides forward to notify Chief of Police Jesse Curry that the president has been shot, and Clint Hill rushes forward to assist Jackie, who is climbing out on the back of the limo to retrieve a chunk of JFK's skull and brains. Frame 313 features a spray of blood that Ryan confirmed to Noel had been painted in, which John Costello has confirmed because it dissipates far too rapidly to be real. Frame 314 displays an apparent gushing out of brains and skull to the right front, which is referred to as the blob, which it turns out was added to create the impression of the effect of a shot fired from behind. Frames following 313 show the passengers moving forward when they should have been pulled back as Greer accelerated the limo. I think they worried that bystanders would remember the passengers being thrown forward by the abrupt halt and therefore kept those frames in but created a framework within which the limo was supposed to be accelerating. While it is difficult to take your eyes off JFK, if you focus on Nellie and John Connolly, and Greer and Roy Kellerman in the passenger seat, you will see what I'm talking about, but it requires a certain degree of concentration. Clint Hill has consistently described his actions in rushing forward, pushing Jackie down into the back seat, lying across their bodies and peering into a fist-sized blowout at the back of his head, then giving his colleagues a thumbs down, all before reaching the triple underpass. Roy Kellerman supported him when he told the Warren Commission that he had looked back and seen Hill lying across the trunk, which was actually the back seat, before the limo had reached the triple underpass. Since the closest that Clint gets to Jackie in the extant film is shown here, we have yet another line of proof that what we have is not the original film. It also means this photograph, called Ulchin 7, is another fake, since by this point Clint was lying across the rear seat. Just think what would have happened to his body had Greer accelerated before Clint was situated there. His body would have been left in the street as a function of elementary physics. Jack White has therefore raised the question of whether Zapruder filmed the Zapruder film, since his secretary seems to have blocked his access to take it. But the answer is obvious. Zapruder did not film the Zapruder film, since no one filmed a fabricated film which was created in a photo and film laboratory. Zapruder inadvertently revealed his complicity by describing a wound, the blowout to the right front of JFK's skull, that did not occur, but was only added to the film during its reconstruction. Frame 317 shows how the blowout to the back of his head was painted over in black, which has been confirmed by a group of Hollywood film restoration experts. They were stunned by how crudely it had been done. When you compare frames like 317 with frame 374, the deception is obvious. The extant film is not even internally consistent. It is therefore stunning that there are prominent experts, such as Josiah Thompson and Robert Groden, who still persist to this day in maintaining that the extant film is authentic. Here is another comparison of early films with frames 374. Jack White noticed that Jackie's face seems to have been lost in some of these images. Anyone who doubts whether the Umbrella Man and the Cuban were involved should consider how calmly they responded to the assassination. Here they are sitting quietly at the concrete, no doubt congratulating themselves for a job well done. JFK appears to have been hit 4 times, once in the throat from in front, once in the back from behind, and twice in the head, once from behind and once from in front. The shots to his throat and to his right temple appear to have been fired from above ground level sewer openings between the roadway and the top of the north and the south sides of the triple underpass. The most probable sequence: a shot fired from the county records building struck the president's back shortly before the shot through the throat from the south end of the triple underpass. Then a shot from the Dal-Tex missed and injured Tague. A shot from the book depository hit John Connolly. The driver pulled the limousine to the left and stopped. A second shot from the Dal-Tex hit JFK in the back of the head. He fell forward and Jackie eased him up. She was looking him in the face when a shot from the north end of the triple underpass hit his right temple with an exploding bullet. A third shot from the Dal-Tex missed and hit the chrome strip. Other shots probably hit John Connolly, or missed and hit the chrome strip, or were found in the grass. The shot from the county records building appears to have been fired by a Dallas Deputy Sheriff Harry Weatherford, who boasted that he shot lots of people. Penn Jones, a legendary early student of the assassination, learned that he obtained a custom-made silencer a few weeks before the shooting. The shot to the throat passed through the windshield and made the sound of a firecracker en route to its target. That one appears to have been fired by an Air Force expert named Jack Lawrence, who went to work for the automobile dealership that provided the vehicles for the motorcade of different makes and colors, no doubt so the conspirators would know who was where. He showed up at the dealership after the shooting, muddy and nauseated, which I believe resulted from his making his escape through the sewer system after taking his shot. Here's a close-up of the Dal-Tex, where 3 shots appear to have been fired from the broom closet window of a uranium mining company owned by the CIA. Those shots appear to have been fired by Nestor Tony Escudero, an anti-Castro Cuban for whom a statue has been erected in Little Havana. One missed and injured the distant bystander James Tague. Another missed and hit the chrome strip above the windshield. The third hit JFK in the back of the head during the limo stop. These appear to have been the only shots fired with an unsilenced weapon, a Mannlicher Carcano, to create the impression of 3 shots having been fired from the 6th floor of the adjacent book depository, where the acoustics would be very comparable. In Freedom Park, there are only 2 statues, where the other is of Jose Marti, who freed Cuba from Spanish domination. If you were to ask somebody why there's a statue to Tony Escudero, you could be told, because he took care of business. Roscoe White was a Dallas police officer with ties to the CIA. His son Ricky discovered a diary which enables the agency to know where their operatives are in order to cover for them as appropriate. It would have been admissible evidence in a court of law, but he gave it to the FBI, and it has since disappeared. Frank Sturgis appears to have fired the shot to the right temple that killed JFK. When he was arrested in New York for coming there to assassinate Marita Lorenz, so she could not testify to the HSCA, they had a conversation about JFK during which he told the detective Jim Rothstein, whom I know, that he had been there and took him out because he had double-crossed the brigade at the Bay of Pigs and was jeopardizing national security by womanizing with agents of foreign governments. I confirmed this with Jim before flying here. I found this photograph in Jesse Curry's JFK assassination file and was surprised to find the very familiar figure of George H.W. Bush in front of the book depository. George H.W. Bush was photographed there. He appears to have been involved in the Bay of Pigs event, where one of the ships was rechristened Houston and another Barbara. The operation was codenamed Zapata, which was the name of the family oil drilling company. If the evasion had been a success, I suspect Zapata would have had a concession to drill all over the Caribbean basin. The 3 tramps who were photographed being escorted through Dealey Plaza after being arrested in a railroad boxcar loaded with weapons, ammo, and explosives were probably the fallback patsies had Lee not worked out. I got to know the third of the 3 and the oldest, who was not E. Howard Hunt, as many believe, but Chauncey Marvin Holt, who prepared 15 sets of forged Secret Service credentials for use in and around the crime scene. One of these photos includes a man walking past them who has been identified by no less authorities than L. Fletcher Prouty and Victor Krulak, the former commandant of the Marine Corps, as Edward Lansdale, an Air Force general who is responsible for assassinations around the world working with the CIA. And we have yet another photograph in which Lansdale is waiting to speak to George H.W. Bush, who claimed not to remember where he was at the time of the assassination. The only other person of whom I know that to be true was Richard Nixon, who flew out of Love Field 2 hours before JFK flew in. Richard Hook has done extensive research on Bush and the Dal-Tex, where a person who identified himself as a Houston oil man was arrested coming out of the building and taken to police headquarters. Like the tramps, he was not booked but released, where he returned to the plaza and met with others, one of whom was Lansdale. Richard believes, and he may be right, that Bush was in that broom closet and supervised the shots that were fired from that location. Malcolm Mack Wallace was Lyndon's personal hitman and killed at least a dozen people for him, including one of his own sisters. He appears to have been firing for the west side of the book depository opposite the assassin's lair, where his fingerprint was found on one of the boxes arranged to create the impression of having been set up to conceal the shooter's presence. Billy Saul Lovelady Estes knew him, and Cliff Carter, LBJ's executive assistant, personally, and told William Raymond, a French investigative journalist, that Lyndon had sent Cliff Carter down to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place for the assassination. To my astonishment, Richard discovered a photograph of George H.W. Bush and Malcolm Mack Wallace from Skull and Bones at Yale. Another individual photographed in Dealey Plaza was George W. Bush, who appears to be somewhat lost, probably because his father had been arrested and he did not know where he was. Others were there to pay their last respects, including a half dozen or more CIA officials who were photographed at the intersection of Houston and Maine. Another was Lucien Conin Wright, among the most notorious of CIA assassins. His presence in Dealey Plaza's center thus lends further weight to the central role of the CIA. When his image was discovered, the attempt was made to claim it had actually been someone named Robert Adams on the left. Their features are quite different, however, as Jack White explained in this comparison. Adams has a long face, long chin, and left ear top in, while Conin, like the man in the photograph, has a square face, short chin, and left ear top out. The charade was exposed by a ludicrous, apparently fabricated newspaper article in which he was said to have watched the motorcade on Thursday, 23 November 1963, as an attempt to distract attention from the image of Lucien Conin, where neither the day of the week nor the date of the month were correct. On Air Force One, LBJ gets a wink and a nod from Congressman Albert Thomas for a job well done during his swearing in, which he claimed had been recommended by Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General, which was not true and unnecessary under the Constitution, but it created the opportunity to leave the casket unattended, during which it appears the body was removed, placed in a body bag, and stored in a secret compartment to be offloaded at Andrews Air Force Base onto a helicopter and flown to Walter Reed. Jack Ruby, who had worked for Nixon as a congressman, shot Oswald, and the case against him was sealed. He would later say that if someone else had been the vice president, this would not have happened. Ruby believed he had been injected with a rapid developing cancer, with Judith Mary Baker has reported having been involved in developing in New Orleans with David Ferry, Lee Oswald, and Dr. Mary Sherman. The claim has often been made that the strongest proof against conspiracy is that no one has talked. That, of course, is false. As Noel Twyman, Bloody Treason, 1997, has observed, at least 8 prominent figures talked about it before and after the event, including Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, and even Sam Giancana. Others, including Chauncey Holt, Charles Harrelson, Jim Hicks, and Jack Ruby, reinforcing the conclusions of Lyndon's mistress, Madeline Duncan Brown, Texas in the Morning, 1997, Bar McClellan, Blood, Money, and Power, 2003, Billy Saul Estes, A Texan's Legend, 2005, and E. Howard Hunt in his Rolling Stone Confessions, 2007, all of whom implicate Lyndon Johnson as the pivotal player in the assassination of JFK. Shattering the cover-up has falsified many theories about the conspiracy. The Mafia could not have extended its reach into Bethesda Naval Hospital to alter X-rays under the control of medical officers of the U.S. Navy agents of the Secret Service and the president's personal physician, for example. Neither pro nor anti-Castro Cubans could have substituted another brain for the original. And even if the KGB had abilities comparable to the CIA to recreate films, it could not have gained access to the Zapruder, nor could any of these things have been done by Lee Oswald, who was either incarcerated or already dead. Noel Twyman has explained that the perfect plan was by combining the CIA military with the Secret Service, the Mafia, LBJ, and J. Edgar Hoover. The weight of the evidence suggests that that was always Lyndon's plan, where his close relationship with Edgar, who hated the Kennedys, made the rest of it fall into place relatively effortlessly when JFK antagonized the CIA, threatening to shatter it into 1,000 pieces. The Joint Chiefs, by refusing to invade Cuba over their unanimous recommendation, signing an above-ground test ban treaty with the Soviets over their unanimous opposition, and withdrawing our advisors from Vietnam, where they believed that a stand had to be taken against the expansion of international godless communism. Bobby had been cracking down on organized crime for the first time in history, and JFK was planning to cut the oil depletion allowance, which riled the oilmen, who put up the money for the assassination. So Noel appears to have got it right. Conservatives also feared a Kennedy dynasty, where Jack would serve 2 terms and then Bobby 2 more, followed by Teddy. It might have been good for America, but it would not have been good for corruption. They did what they had to do to promote their own special interests at the expense of the nation, where we have had a succession of presidents, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, George Sr., and George Jr., who would never have held that office but for the death of JFK. The course of the nation since more than justifies the inference that the events of 22 November 1963 did not mark just the death of a president, but the assassination of America.